I was standing in my own kitchen, watching my daughter-in-law rearrange my furniture like she was decorating for a magazine shoot, when she turned to me with that plastic smile and said the words that would change everything between us forever. "You're not family anymore, Patricia. This is our house now, and you need to start acting like a guest." That's when I realized my son Marcus had been planning this hostile takeover for months, and his wife Stephanie thought she could erase 43 years of my life with a single conversation. But what they didn't know was that I had been building something they could never touch, never steal, and never understand. And by the time I was finished reminding them exactly who owned what, they would learn that some battles are won not with shouting, but with strategy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Patricia Ann Caldwell, and at 68 years old, I thought I had seen every kind of betrayal life could serve up. I was wrong. Last Thursday morning started like any other day in the colonial house I had called home for over 4 decades. The same house where I had raised Marcus from a scrappy 8-year-old after his father walked out, where I had scraped together mortgage payments working double shifts at the hospital, where I had celebrated every birthday, graduation, and holiday that mattered. The same house that now felt like a battlefield I was apparently losing without even knowing there was a war. I had been living with Marcus and Stephanie for 6 months, ever since my mild heart episode in February. The doctor said I needed someone nearby, just as a precaution, and Marcus had insisted I move into the guest wing of what used to be my own home. At the time it seemed reasonable, even sweet. My son wanted to take care of me, and Stephanie had smiled and nodded and said all the right things about family sticking together. I should have known better. I should have seen the signs when she started referring to their kitchen and their living room. I should have paid attention when Marcus stopped asking my opinion about household decisions and started informing me of changes after they were already made. But I was grieving, still processing the shock of my body betraying me for the first time in my life, and I mistook their control for care. I thought I was being looked after. Instead, I was being managed, manipulated, and slowly erased from my own existence. The morning everything came to a head, I had woken up early as usual and padded to the kitchen in my slippers, expecting to find my familiar routine waiting for me. Instead, I found Stephanie standing on a stepladder, taking down the framed photos from the wall above the breakfast nook. Not just any photos, but the ones I had carefully arranged over the years. Pictures of Marcus's high school graduation, his first job, family vacations, and yes, photos of his father before everything went wrong. She was dropping them into a cardboard box labeled Patricia's Things, in her neat, precise handwriting, like I was a deceased relative whose belongings needed to be sorted and stored. I stood there for a moment, watching this woman who had been in my life for barely 3 years dismantling the visual history of my son's childhood, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Not anger yet, just a creeping realization that I had been sleepwalking through the last 6 months while they quietly erased me. I cleared my throat, and Stephanie turned around, not startled, not embarrassed, just mildly inconvenienced like I had interrupted her during an important task. She was wearing one of those athleisure outfits that cost more than I used to spend on groceries in a month, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect ponytail that probably took 30 minutes to achieve that effortless look. Everything about her was calculated, controlled, and completely confident in her right to be rearranging my life. I asked her what she was doing, keeping my voice calm and curious rather than accusatory, because I still believed there might be a reasonable explanation. Maybe she was redecorating as a surprise. Maybe she was cleaning and planned to put everything back. Maybe I was overreacting to something innocent. Stephanie stepped down from the ladder and set the last photo in the box with the kind of care you might use handling evidence in a crime scene, deliberate and final. Then she looked at me with those pale blue eyes that never seemed to hold any real warmth and explained, in the tone you might use with a confused child, that she and Marcus had decided the house needed a more modern aesthetic. The photos were outdated, she said, and didn't match the new direction they wanted for their home. Their home. Not our home. Not my home. Their home. As if I was a tenant whose lease had expired without notice. I pointed out, still trying to stay reasonable, that some of those pictures were irreplaceable memories of Marcus growing up, moments from before she even knew he existed. Surely we could find a compromise, maybe move them to a different wall or display them in a more modern style. I was offering her a bridge, a way for both of us to feel heard and respected. Instead, she built a wall. That's when she said it. The line that cut through every pretense and revealed exactly what this conversation was really about. She set down the box, crossed her arms and looked at me like I was a problem that had been bothering her for months. Her voice was steady, almost gentle, which somehow made the words hit harder than if she had been screaming. "You're not family anymore, Patricia. This is our house now, and you need to start acting like a guest. A temporary guest who has overstayed her welcome and needs to start making other arrangements. Marcus and I have been patient, but we're ready to start our real life together, and that doesn't include having his mother hovering around every corner, criticizing our choices and living in the past." The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire I hadn't seen coming. I felt my legs go weak, not from my heart condition but from the sheer audacity of what she had just said. This woman, who had been living in my house, sleeping in my guest room before she married my son, eating meals I had cooked, and accepting help I had freely given, was now telling me I was no longer family in my own home. I managed to ask where Marcus was, whether he knew about this conversation, whether this was his idea or hers. The question seemed to amuse her because she smiled, not the plastic social smile I was used to, but something sharper and more genuine. She told me Marcus was at work, but that they had discussed this extensively. He was just too kind to hurt my feelings directly, so she had volunteered to be the messenger. She was doing him a favor, really, by handling the unpleasant task of setting boundaries with his overbearing mother. Overbearing. The word hit me like a physical blow, because it was so far from how I saw myself, so distant from the woman who had spent decades putting Marcus's needs before her own, who had worked extra shifts to pay for his college, who had welcomed Stephanie into our family with open arms and genuine affection. I had never criticized their choices, never interfered with their relationship, never made demands or created drama. I had been grateful just to be included, just to still matter in my son's life. But apparently gratitude looked like overreach to Stephanie. Apparently love looked like interference. Apparently the crime of being present in my own home had been building a case against me that I never saw coming. I asked her what exactly I had done wrong, what specific behaviors she wanted me to change, because I genuinely didn't understand what I was being accused of. Her answer revealed everything I needed to know about how she saw me and how long she had been planning this moment. She didn't have specific complaints because this wasn't about my behavior, this was about my existence. She didn't want me to act differently, she wanted me gone.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The Heart episode had given them the perfect excuse to get me under their roof and under their control, and now that I was dependent on them for housing and care, they could dictate the terms of my continued presence in their lives. She had been waiting for the right moment to make her position clear, and apparently that moment was now. I stood there in my own kitchen, surrounded by 40 years of memories that were being packed away like old Christmas decorations, and realized I was looking at a stranger. Not just Stephanie, who had never been anything more than an actress playing the role of loving daughter-in-law, but Marcus too. Because the son I had raised would never have agreed to this conversation, would never have sent his wife to deliver this message, would never have referred to our family home as theirs exclusively. Either I had been completely blind to who my son really was, or Stephanie had been working systematically to change him, to separate him from me, to make him see our relationship as a burden rather than a bond. Either way, I was standing in the ruins of everything I thought I knew about my family, holding the pieces of a life that had apparently been built on quicksand. I told Stephanie I needed to think about what she had said, that this was a lot to process, and that we should probably continue the conversation when Marcus got home. I was buying time, trying to gather my thoughts and figure out how to respond to something I had never imagined I would have to face. She nodded like she was being reasonable, like she was giving me a generous opportunity to come to terms with my new reality. But then she added one more thing, almost casually, like it was an afterthought rather than the knife twist it actually was. She mentioned that they had already been looking into senior living communities in the area, places that specialized in independent living for people with health concerns. Nothing too restrictive, she assured me, just somewhere I could have my own space and access to medical care without being a burden on their household. They had even picked up some brochures, which she could show me later if I was interested. The word burden echoed in my head long after she left the kitchen to continue her redecorating project in the living room. I could hear her moving furniture, the scraping of chair legs against hardwood floors that I had refinished myself 15 years ago, the sound of my life being rearranged without my consent. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same one where Marcus had done his homework every night, where we had eaten thousands of meals together, where I had balanced the checkbook and paid the bills and made the decisions that kept our small family afloat. And I realized that this wasn't just about Stephanie wanting me gone, this was about power, control, and the systematic erasure of my role in Marcus's life. She wanted him all to herself, wanted to be the only woman who mattered to him, wanted to rewrite their story so that it began when they met, and everything before that was just inconvenient history. I was the inconvenient history. I was the evidence that Marcus had a life and an identity before her, that he had been shaped by someone else's love and sacrifice. But what Stephanie didn't understand, what she couldn't possibly have known from her comfortable middle-class background and her easy path through life, was that women like me don't just disappear quietly. We don't pack ourselves away in labeled boxes and fade into the background because someone else decides we're no longer necessary. We fight. And when we fight to win. I spent the rest of that morning sitting at my kitchen table, not moving, not cleaning, not doing any of the small tasks that usually filled my days. Instead, I was thinking, planning, and remembering exactly what I was made of. By the time I heard Marcus's car in the driveway that evening, I had made several decisions that would change everything for all of us. But I didn't say a word about my conversation with Stephanie when he walked through the door. I just smiled, asked about his day, and served dinner like nothing had happened. Because if Stephanie wanted to play games, I was going to show her what a real player looked like. If she thought she could manipulate my son against me, I was going to demonstrate exactly why that was a mistake. And if she believed that telling me I wasn't family anymore would make me disappear, she was about to learn that some family bonds can't be broken by words, threats, or even betrayal. The war she had started that morning was about to become the fight of her life. But unlike her, I wasn't going to announce my strategy in advance. I was just going to execute it, quietly, methodically, and completely. And by the time she realized what was happening, it would be far too late for her to stop me. That night, after Marcus and Stephanie had gone to bed, I sat in my room with a notebook and started making lists. Not packing lists or moving plans, but strategy lists. Lists of assets, legal documents, relationships, and resources that they didn't know about, couldn't access, and couldn't control. Lists of every favor I was owed, every connection I had maintained, every piece of leverage I had accumulated over nearly 7 decades of being underestimated by people who thought they were smarter than me. I had been a nurse for 35 years before I retired, which meant I was used to making life and death decisions under pressure, managing crisis situations, and working with people who thought they knew better than I did. I had raised a child alone through his teenage years, which meant I was used to outmaneuvering someone who thought they could outsmart me. I had survived poverty, divorce, illness, and loss, which meant I was used to finding strength in places other people didn't know existed. Stephanie had made the classic mistake of assuming that because I was older, quieter, and more polite than she was, I was also weaker, less capable, and easier to defeat. She had confused kindness with weakness, generosity with desperation, and love with dependence. She was about to learn the difference between all of those things, and the education was going to cost her everything she thought she had won. The first item on my list was simple but crucial. Find out exactly what legal rights I had in a house that was still technically mine. Because while Stephanie might have convinced Marcus to let her redecorate and rearrange, and while they might have been making decisions about my future, they had forgotten one important detail. The deed to this house still had my name on it. Not their names. My name. And that meant I had options they didn't even know existed. The second item was more complicated but equally important. Figure out how much of Marcus's current attitude was his own, And how much was Stephanie's influence? Because the son I had raised would never have agreed to have his wife tell his mother she wasn't family anymore. Either he had changed more than I realized, or he didn't know what conversation had taken place in our kitchen that morning. Either way, I needed to know what I was really dealing with before I decided how to handle it. The third item on my list was the most important one: decide how far I was willing to go to protect myself and my home. Because once I started fighting back, there would be no going back to the way things were. Once I reminded Stephanie, who actually owned this house, our relationship would be permanently changed. Once I showed Marcus that his wife was trying to manipulate him into betraying his own mother, his marriage might be permanently damaged. I had to be sure I was ready for those consequences, ready to risk everything I had left of my family in order to save what was left of my dignity and independence. I had to be sure that the alternative, accepting Stephanie's terms and fading quietly into whatever senior living facility she had chosen for me, was actually worse than the potential fallout from fighting back. It didn't take me long to decide. I had spent 6 months watching them slowly take over my house, my routine, and my relationship with my son. I had tried to be accommodating, tried to be grateful, tried to be the kind of house guest who didn't cause problems. And where had that gotten me? A cardboard box, labeled with my name, and a conversation about senior living communities. If being polite and cooperative had led to being told I wasn't family anymore, then maybe it was time to try a different approach. Maybe it was time to remind everyone involved that cooperation goes both ways, that respect has to be earned rather than demanded, and that some people are much more dangerous when they're quiet than when they're loud. I closed the notebook, tucked it under my mattress, and went to sleep for the first time in months, without worrying about being too much trouble, making too much noise, or taking up too much space. Because tomorrow, I was going to start taking up exactly as much space as I was entitled to. And if that made anyone uncomfortable, they were welcome to find somewhere else to live. The next morning, I woke up with the kind of clarity that comes from finally knowing exactly what you're fighting for and exactly how you plan to win. I made my coffee, read the newspaper, and waited for Stephanie to start her daily routine of rearranging my life without my permission. But this time, I was going to be ready for her. This time, when she tried to tell me what I could and couldn't do in my own house, I was going to remind her of a few facts she seemed to have forgotten, starting with the most important fact of all. This was still my house, no matter what she chose to call it. And I was still the woman who had built a life here, raised a family here, and survived everything life had thrown at me for the past 4 decades. I was still Patricia Ann Caldwell, and I was about to show everyone what that name really meant. The first test came sooner than I expected. I was sitting at the kitchen table, drinking my second cup of coffee and making notes in my day planner, when Stephanie breezed into the room wearing her workout clothes and carrying her yoga mat. She glanced at me sitting in what she obviously considered her space and frowned slightly, like my presence was disrupting her morning routine. She opened the refrigerator and started pulling out ingredients for one of her elaborate smoothies, the kind that required 5 different types of expensive fruit and 3 different protein powders. As she worked, she started talking about her day, but not to me. She was talking to herself, or maybe to an invisible audience, describing her plans to meet her sister for lunch and then spend the afternoon shopping for new throw pillows for the living room. The throw pillows I had selected and purchased just last year, which she had apparently decided needed to be replaced as part of her modernization project. She didn't ask my opinion about the pillows. She didn't even acknowledge that I was in the room until she needed to reach around me to get to the blender, and then she sighed dramatically like I was an obstacle in her path. That's when I decided to conduct my first small experiment in reclaiming my territory. Instead of moving out of her way, or apologizing for existing in my own kitchen, I stayed exactly where I was and continued writing in my planner. When she had to reach around me a second time, I looked up and smiled pleasantly, as if I had just noticed her struggling with her smoothie preparation. I offered to help, or to move to a different spot if she needed more counter space. The offer was genuine but strategic, because it forced her to either accept my assistance, which would acknowledge my right to be helpful in my own home, or to ask me to move, which would require her to admit she was trying to push me out of my own space. She chose a third option. She ignored my offer completely and continued making her smoothie with increasingly aggressive movements, slamming cabinet doors and clattering utensils like she was performing her frustration for my benefit. The message was clear. My presence was unwelcome, my offers of help were unnecessary, and my refusal to automatically defer to her convenience was selfish. But I had learned something important from that brief interaction. Stephanie's power over me depended entirely on my willingness to be intimidated by her displeasure. The moment I stopped caring about her comfort level, stopped trying to avoid conflict, and stopped treating her irritation as my problem to solve, her main weapon against me became useless. So I finished my coffee at my own pace, made notes about 3 different lawyers I planned to contact that day, and eventually wandered into the living room to see what other changes she had made to my home overnight. What I found there stopped me in my tracks and erased any remaining doubt about whether this situation could be resolved with conversation and compromise. She had removed every single family photograph from the mantelpiece and replaced them with abstract art pieces that looked like they had been purchased at a hotel liquidation sale. The wedding photo of Marcus and me from his City Hall ceremony was gone. The picture of him receiving his college diploma was gone. The framed photo of my parents, his grandparents, was gone. Everything that connected this house to our family's history had been erased and replaced with generic decorative objects that could have belonged to anyone. But it was what she had done with the photographs that made my blood pressure spike in a way that had nothing to do with my heart condition. They weren't packed away in a box for storage. They were piled in a garbage bag sitting next to the front door, like trash waiting to be taken to the curb. Not donated, not stored, not even given back to me. Thrown away like they had no value, no meaning, no right to exist in her carefully curated vision of domestic perfection. I stood there staring at that garbage bag and felt something shift inside me, something deeper and more permanent than anger. This wasn't just about territory or power or even respect anymore. This was about the systematic erasure of my son's childhood, my family's legacy, and my right to exist as anything more than an inconvenient reminder of the life Marcus had before Stephanie decided to improve it. I walked over to the bag, opened it, and carefully removed every single photograph, checking each one for damage. Most were fine, but the frame around my parents' wedding portrait was cracked, and the glass over Marcus's graduation picture had a small chip in one corner. Small damages, probably accidental, but they felt deliberate in that moment because everything else about this situation had been so carefully calculated. I was still holding the photographs when Stephanie finished her smoothie preparation and found me in the living room. She stopped short when she saw me with the pictures, and for the first time since I had known her, she looked genuinely uncomfortable. Not embarrassed exactly, but caught off guard, like she hadn't expected me to discover her redecorating project so soon. I asked her, very calmly, why my family photographs were in a garbage bag. She recovered quickly from her momentary discomfort and explained, in that same patient tone she had used the day before, that she was just clearing out clutter. The photographs were outdated, she said, and the frames didn't match the new aesthetic she was creating. She had planned to ask if I wanted them before she threw them away, but since I was right there, I could just take them to my room if they were important to me. The casual cruelty of that response, the assumption that my family's history could be dismissed as clutter and banished to my bedroom like I was a child being sent to my room, finally pushed me past the point of polite negotiation. I set the photographs down on the coffee table, turned to face her directly, and spoke in the voice I had perfected during 35 years of dealing with difficult patients, incompetent doctors, and emergency situations where someone needed to take charge immediately. I told her that we needed to clarify a few things about this house, our living arrangement, and the decisions that were being made without consulting me. I wasn't asking for a conversation, I was informing her that one was going to happen, right? Now, whether she wanted to participate or not. And I was going to start by reminding her of some facts that she seemed to have forgotten in her enthusiasm to redecorate my life. The first fact was that this house belonged to me. Not to her, not to Marcus, and not to them as a couple. My name was on the deed, my credit had secured the mortgage, and my money had paid every single payment for over 20 years, until the house was fully mine. They lived here at my invitation, not by right, and that invitation could be revoked at any time if they continued to treat my home like their personal property. The second fact was that I had moved into the guest wing at Marcus's request, not because I was unable to care for myself, but because the doctor had recommended having someone nearby as a precaution after my heart episode. That made me a family member recovering in her own home, not a boarder whose privileges could be limited by someone else's aesthetic preferences. The third fact was that every single item in this house, from the furniture to the photographs to the throw pillows she wanted to replace, had been chosen by me, purchased with my money, and arranged according to my preferences over the course of 4 decades. If she didn't like my decorating choices, she was welcome to live somewhere else and decorate however she pleased. But she was not welcome to throw away my belongings or redecorate my house without my permission. The fourth and most important fact was that I was not going anywhere. Not to a senior living facility, not to a smaller apartment, and definitely not to my bedroom to hide, while she erased every trace of my family's history from my own home. If anyone was uncomfortable with the current living arrangement, if anyone felt like they didn't have enough space or enough control over their environment, they knew where the door was. I delivered this speech in the same calm, measured tone Stephanie had been using to dismiss my concerns, but with the kind of authority that comes from actually owning what you're talking about. And I watched her face change as the reality of her situation finally started to penetrate the bubble of entitlement she had been living in for the past 6 months. Because up until that moment, she had been operating under the assumption that I was dependent on them, that my heart condition had made me vulnerable and compliant, that my age and my gratitude for their help had eliminated any real power I might have had in this relationship. She had been treating me like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected because she thought I had no choice but to accept whatever terms she offered. But now she was looking at a woman who clearly did have choices, who understood exactly what her legal rights were, and who was not nearly as grateful for their help as she had appeared to be. She was looking at someone who had been quietly assessing the situation for months, someone who had been holding her tongue not out of weakness but out of strategy, and someone who was fully prepared to use every advantage she possessed to protect herself. The silence stretched between us for what felt like several minutes, though it was probably only seconds. I could see her mentally recalibrating, trying to figure out how to respond to this version of me she hadn't met before. The sweet, accommodating, slightly helpless mother-in-law she thought she had been managing was nowhere to be found. In her place was someone who looked remarkably like the woman who had raised Marcus alone, who had worked her way through nursing school while supporting a child, who had survived everything life had thrown at her by being tougher than anyone expected. Finally, Stephanie found her voice, though it was pitched higher than usual and missing some of its usual confidence. She said that she hadn't meant to overstep, that she was just trying to make the house feel more like home for all of us, and that she hoped we could work together to find a solution that made everyone comfortable. It was a strategic retreat, an attempt to reframe her redecoration project as a collaborative effort rather than a hostile takeover. But it was too little, too late, because I had already seen who she really was and what she really thought of me. I had already heard her tell me I wasn't family anymore. I had already found my belongings in a garbage bag, waiting to be thrown away. I told her I appreciated her willingness to cooperate, but that going forward, any changes to the house would need my approval since it was my house. Any decisions about my belongings would need my input, since they were my belongings. And any discussions about my future living arrangements would include me as an equal participant, not as a problem to be solved by other people. She nodded and agreed, but I could see the resentment simmering behind her eyes, the barely contained frustration of someone who had thought she was in control and was just discovering she wasn't. She had expected this conversation to end with me apologizing for causing trouble and promising to be more accommodating. Instead, it was ending with her being forced to acknowledge my authority in my own home. But I knew this wasn't over. I had won the first battle by establishing the legal and practical realities of our situation, but Stephanie wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat gracefully. She was going to regroup, strategize, and come back with a different approach. She was going to try to turn Marcus against me, try to convince him that I was being unreasonable and difficult, try to make my life so uncomfortable that I would choose to leave rather than continue fighting. What she didn't know was that I had been expecting this escalation all along. I had been preparing for it since the morning she told me I wasn't family anymore. And I was ready for whatever came next because I finally understood that this wasn't just about living arrangements or decorating choices. This was about whether I was going to spend my remaining years being treated like an unwanted burden, or like the matriarch of a family I had built with my own hands. The answer to that question was simple. I was Patricia Ann Caldwell. I owned this house, I had raised this family, and I had survived every challenge life had thrown at me for 68 years. If Stephanie wanted to test me, if she wanted to see what I was really made of, she was welcome to try. But she was going to learn the same lesson that everyone else who had underestimated me had learned over the years. I was a lot stronger than I looked, a lot smarter than I acted, and a lot more dangerous than anyone expected. And this was my house. That evening, when Marcus came home from his job at the accounting firm, I was waiting for him in the den, with a glass of his favorite bourbon and a stack of documents I had spent the afternoon retrieving from my filing cabinet. The same filing cabinet Stephanie had been eyeing for weeks, probably wondering what important papers I kept locked away from their prying eyes. Now she was about to find out, though not in the way she had imagined. Marcus looked surprised to see me sitting in what used to be our family gathering spot, before Stephanie had declared it too formal for their casual lifestyle. He glanced around nervously, probably wondering if his wife had told him about our morning conversation, probably trying to gauge my mood before deciding how to handle whatever crisis she had created in his absence. I patted the chair next to mine, the same chair where he used to sit when he was in high school, and needed help with his algebra homework or wanted to complain about his teachers. He hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between his desire to avoid conflict and his curiosity about what I might have to say. Finally, habit won over caution, and he settled into the familiar spot with the wariness of a man who knew he was about to have a conversation he didn't want to have. I handed him the bourbon and waited while he took a sip, letting the silence stretch between us until he started to fidget. Then I opened the folder on my lap and pulled out the first document, a copy of the deed to our house with my name clearly visible as the sole owner. I set it on the coffee table between us, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, like I was showing him a grocery receipt. Marcus stared at the paper for a long moment, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of resigned understanding. He took another sip of bourbon, longer this time, and asked me why I was showing him this. His voice was careful, neutral, the tone of someone trying not to say the wrong thing until he figured out what the right thing might be. I told him that I thought there might be some confusion in his household about who actually owned what, who made the decisions around here, and who had the legal right to throw away family photographs or redecorate without permission. I had spent the day reviewing my financial and legal situation, and I wanted to make sure he understood exactly where things stood before any more misunderstandings occurred. The second document I pulled from the folder was a copy of my will, the most recent version dated just 3 months earlier. I had updated it after my heart episode, not because I expected to die anytime soon, but because serious medical events have a way of clarifying your priorities and making you think about legacy in ways you might have avoided before. Marcus glanced at the will but didn't pick it up, probably because he assumed he already knew what it contained. He was my only child, my only heir, and he had probably spent years assuming that everything I owned would automatically become his when I died. What he didn't know was that wills could be changed, that inheritance was a privilege rather than a right, and that his recent behavior had given me serious doubts about his fitness to inherit the life I had built. The third document was more recent, so recent that the ink was barely dry. It was a consultation agreement with the law firm of Henderson, Walsh & Associates, specializing in estate planning and elder law. I had spent 2 hours that afternoon in their offices, discussing my situation with Sandra Walsh, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who had listened to my story without judgment, and then laid out my options with the kind of clarity that comes from handling similar cases dozens of times. Marcus finally looked up from the papers, his expression somewhere between concern and annoyance, and asked me what all of this was about. He wanted to know if I was sick again, if something had happened that I hadn't told him, if there was some crisis he needed to know about. His tone was still careful, but I could hear the underlying irritation, the impatience of a man who thought he was being manipulated by an overly dramatic parent. I set the folder aside and looked at him directly, this son I had raised from a confused and angry boy into what I had hoped was a decent man. I told him that I wasn't sick, that there was no crisis, and that nothing had happened that he didn't already know about. But I had spent some time thinking about our family, our relationship, and the way I was being treated in my own home, and I had reached some conclusions that he might find interesting. The first conclusion was that somewhere along the way, he had forgotten that I was his mother, not his burden. He had forgotten that I had chosen to let them live in my house, not because I was desperate for company or unable to care for myself, but because I loved him and wanted to help him save money while he and Stephanie established their careers. I had forgotten to charge them rent, forgotten to set boundaries, forgotten to maintain the kind of authority that prevented children from thinking they could parent their parents. The second conclusion was that Stephanie had been working systematically to undermine my position in our family, to make him see me as a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be respected. She had been feeding him a steady diet of concerns about my health, my safety, my ability to live independently, until he started seeing dependency where there was none, and fragility where there was only temporary vulnerability. The third conclusion was the most important one, and I could see from his face that he wasn't going to like it. I told him that if he wanted to continue living in my house, if he wanted to continue benefiting from my generosity and support, he was going to have to choose between his wife's campaign to erase me and his relationship with the woman who had raised him. Because I was done being treated like an unwelcome guest in my own home. Marcus set down his bourbon glass and ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his teenage years, when he was trying to process information he didn't want to accept. He asked me what Stephanie had done, what specific incident had triggered this conversation, whether we had fought about something he should know about. So I told him. I told him about finding my family photographs in a garbage bag, about being informed that I was no longer family, about the suggestion that I needed to find alternative living arrangements so they could start their real life together. I told him about the senior living brochures, the redecoration project, and the systematic removal of everything that connected our house to our family's history. I watched his face as I talked, looking for signs of surprise, outrage, or at least concern about the way his wife was treating his mother. What I saw instead was discomfort, resignation, and the kind of guilty recognition that suggested he knew more about these conversations than he had let on. He wasn't shocked by Stephanie's behavior because he had already heard her complaints about me, had already discussed the possibility of finding me alternative housing, had already agreed that my presence in their home was becoming inconvenient. When I finished talking, Marcus was quiet for a long time, staring at the documents on the coffee table, like they might provide him with an escape route from this conversation. Finally, he looked up at me with the expression of someone who was about to say something he knew would hurt, but felt he had to say anyway. He told me that Stephanie was just trying to help, that she was concerned about my health and safety, that she wanted what was best for everyone involved. He said that maybe she hadn't expressed herself very well, but her heart was in the right place. He said that living together had been more challenging than any of them had expected, and maybe it was time to consider other arrangements that would give everyone more space and independence. The careful language, the diplomatic phrasing, the way he managed to make Stephanie's cruelty sound like thoughtful planning, told me everything I needed to know about how deep her influence ran. This wasn't just a case of a son being temporarily manipulated by his wife. This was a complete transformation of his values, his priorities, and his understanding of what he owed the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. I asked him if he remembered who had worked double shifts to pay for his college tuition when his father disappeared and left us with nothing. I asked him if he remembered who had sat up all night when he had pneumonia at age 12, who had driven him to baseball practice every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 years, who had co-signed his student loans when no bank would approve them based on his credit alone. I asked him if he remembered who had given him a place to live when he lost his first job, who had helped him buy his first car, who had welcomed Stephanie into our family, even though she had never made any effort to understand or appreciate the life we had built together before she arrived. Marcus had the grace to look ashamed as I recited this history, but shame wasn't the same as understanding, and understanding wasn't the same as change. He mumbled something about being grateful for everything I had done, about knowing how much I had sacrificed, about wanting to take care of me the way I had taken care of him. But then he circled back to Stephanie's talking points, explaining that taking care of me meant making sure I was safe, that I had access to medical care, that I wasn't isolated or struggling with tasks that were becoming too difficult for me to manage alone. He painted a picture of me as a frail, declining woman who needed protection from her own stubbornness, who was too proud to admit she needed help, who would benefit from the social interaction and medical oversight that a good senior living community could provide. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, turning genuine love and concern into weapons against my independence, making my resistance to their plans seem like evidence of the very incompetence they were claiming to address. Stephanie had done her work well, convincing him that controlling me was the same as caring for me, that stripping away my autonomy was actually a gift I was too confused to appreciate. I let him finish his speech, nodding occasionally like I was considering his points, giving him the space to reveal exactly how thoroughly his wife had reprogrammed his understanding of our relationship. Then I picked up the consultation agreement with the law firm and set it directly in front of him, making sure he could see Sandra Walsh's signature and the date of our meeting. I told him that I had spent the afternoon discussing my legal options with people who specialized in cases like mine, people who dealt every day with families where adult children tried to take control of their parents' lives and assets under the guise of providing care. I had learned some interesting things about my rights, about the protections available to homeowners in my situation, and about the legal consequences of elder abuse, even when it was disguised as concern. The first thing I had learned was that as long as I was mentally competent, which multiple doctors and a formal cognitive assessment had confirmed I was, no one could force me to leave my home or sign away my decision-making authority, no matter how much they worried about my safety or independence. The second thing was that attempting to manipulate, coerce, or defraud an elderly person out of their property or assets was a serious crime, one that could result in both criminal charges and civil liability. The third thing, and this was the one that made Marcus's face go pale, was that inheritance was not guaranteed. Children who abused, neglected, or exploited their elderly parents could be disinherited completely, legally, and permanently, regardless of what previous wills or family expectations might have suggested. I watched him absorb this information, watched him realize that all of his assumptions about his future financial security were based on my continued goodwill, rather than any legal obligation on my part. I watched him understand that treating me like a burden rather than a benefactor might have consequences he had never considered. Marcus reached for his bourbon glass, realized it was empty, and set it back down with the shaky precision of someone whose hands weren't entirely steady. He asked me, very quietly, if I was threatening to disinherit him, if this whole conversation was some kind of ultimatum designed to force him to choose between his wife and his mother. I told him that I wasn't threatening anything, just clarifying the reality of our situation for everyone involved. He was free to make whatever choices he felt were best for his life and his marriage. But he needed to understand that choices had consequences, that treating your mother like an unwanted burden was a choice, and that choosing his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity was also a choice. I told him that I had spent 43 years building a life that included him at the center of it, but that I was perfectly capable of building a life that didn't include him if that became necessary. I had friends, interests, resources, and options he knew nothing about. I had survived worse things than ungrateful children, and I would survive this too if I had to. But I also told him that I would much rather find a way for all of us to live together respectfully, with clear boundaries and mutual consideration for everyone's needs and preferences. That was still possible, but only if he was willing to have some difficult conversations with his wife about the way she had been treating me, and the assumptions she had been making about my future. The ball was in his court, I explained. He could talk to Stephanie about showing me the basic respect due to the owner of the house they lived in, or he could start looking for alternative housing arrangements for his family. But the days of me being managed, manipulated, and marginalized in my own home were over, whether he wanted to acknowledge that or not. Marcus sat in silence for several minutes after I finished talking, occasionally glancing at the legal documents, occasionally looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time in years. Finally, he asked me what exactly I wanted from him, what specific changes would satisfy me, what he needed to do to repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. It was the first question he had asked that sounded like it came from the son I remembered, rather than the husband Stephanie had been training him to become. So I answered it honestly, completely, and with the kind of directness that had been missing from our family conversations for months. I wanted him to tell his wife that the redecoration project was over, that my belongings would not be thrown away or moved without my permission, and that any changes to my house would require my approval. I wanted him to make it clear that I was not moving to a senior living facility, that I was not signing away any of my decision-making authority, and that any future discussions about my care or living situation would include me as an equal participant. Most importantly, I wanted him to stop treating me like I was already dead, like my opinions didn't matter, like my comfort and happiness were less important than his wife's decorating preferences. I wanted him to remember that I was his mother, not his patient, and that respect was not optional in family relationships, regardless of age or health status. I told him that I understood marriage required compromises, and that spouses needed to support each other even when they disagreed with family members. But I also told him that some compromises were too expensive, that some support came at too high a price, and that choosing to participate in your wife's campaign to erase your mother was not the kind of compromise that decent people made. Marcus nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of what I was asking him to do. I could see him calculating the costs, imagining the fights with Stephanie, anticipating the arguments and ultimatums that would follow if he tried to establish the boundaries I was demanding. But I could also see something else in his expression, something that looked like relief, as if part of him had been uncomfortable with the direction his marriage was taking, as if part of him had been waiting for permission to push back against his wife's more extreme demands, as if part of him had missed the mother he used to have before Stephanie decided she needed to be improved. He asked me how much time he had to work things out with Stephanie, whether I was planning to take any immediate legal action, whether the lawyers I had consulted were preparing any formal documents that would force his hand. The questions revealed both his genuine desire to fix our relationship and his practical concern about protecting himself legally if the situation continued to deteriorate. I told him that Sandra Walsh was preparing some paperwork that would formalize my legal protections and make my wishes regarding my care and property crystal clear, but that nothing would be filed unless it became necessary. I wasn't interested in destroying his marriage or creating a public family scandal. I was interested in being treated with dignity in my own home. But I also told him that my patience had limits, that I was not going to spend the remaining years of my life being gradually pushed out of my own house by someone who had never earned the right to make decisions about my future. If he couldn't establish appropriate boundaries with Stephanie within a reasonable time frame, then I would use every legal tool available to protect myself, regardless of how that might affect his marriage or his inheritance prospects. We talked for another hour, working through the details of what needed to change and how he planned to approach the conversation with his wife. By the time we finished, I could see that Marcus understood the seriousness of the situation, even if he wasn't entirely sure how to navigate the competing demands of his wife and his mother. As he got up to leave, he turned back to me with an expression I remembered from his childhood, when he had done something wrong and was trying to figure out how to make amends. He told me he was sorry, that he had gotten caught up in Stephanie's concerns and had lost sight of what was really important, that he wanted to fix things between us. I told him that apologies were a good start, but that actions mattered more than words. I told him that I loved him, that I always had and always would, but that love didn't mean accepting disrespect or allowing myself to be erased from my own life. I told him that being his mother was the most important thing I had ever done, but that it wasn't the only thing I was, and I refused to disappear just to make his wife more comfortable. That night, I heard them fighting. Not the kind of polite, hushed argument that considerate people have when they're trying not to disturb their houseguests, but the kind of full-volume, no-holds-barred fight that happens when two people discover they want fundamentally different things and neither one is willing to compromise. I couldn't hear the specific words through the walls, but I could hear the rhythm of the argument, the rise and fall of voices, the long silences that usually meant someone was trying to regain their composure before the next round began. It went on for hours, stopping and starting, escalating and cooling down, until finally there was nothing but silence from their bedroom. I lay in my own bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the familiar sounds of my house at night. The old furnace cycling on and off, the settling of floorboards that had been walked on for decades, the whisper of wind through trees I had planted when Marcus was in elementary school. These were the sounds of home, my home, and for the first time in months I felt like I had the right to claim them. The next morning I was up early as usual, making coffee and reading the newspaper in my kitchen, when Stephanie appeared in the doorway. She looked like she hadn't slept much, with dark circles under her eyes and her usually perfect hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. But there was something different about her expression, something harder and more focused than I had seen before. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me at the table, not bothering with her usual performance of busy efficiency. Instead, she looked at me directly, with the kind of cold assessment you might give a business competitor you were preparing to destroy. She told me that she and Marcus had talked, that they had discussed my concerns and my legal consultation, and that they understood I felt I had been treated unfairly. She said they wanted to work together to find a solution that would make everyone more comfortable, and she hoped we could approach the problem as adults who wanted the best for everyone involved. It was a masterful opening, acknowledging my complaints without accepting responsibility for them, expressing willingness to cooperate while maintaining her position as an equal negotiator rather than someone who owed me an apology. She was treating me like a business problem to be solved, rather than a family member who deserved respect, but she was doing it with enough diplomatic language to make her contempt sound like collaboration. I set down my newspaper and gave her the same direct look she was giving me. Then I told her that I was glad she wanted to work together, because I had some very specific ideas about how we could improve our living situation. Starting with the immediate return of all my family photographs to their original locations, the restoration of my belongings to their proper places, and a clear understanding that my house would be decorated according to my preferences, not hers. Stephanie's composure slipped just slightly, a tightening around her eyes that suggested she had expected this conversation to go very differently. She had probably planned to offer me some minor concessions in exchange for accepting major limitations on my authority, to make me feel like I was winning while she continued to control the important decisions. Instead, I was treating her like exactly what she was. Someone who lived in my house at my discretion, someone whose comfort was secondary to mine, someone whose opinions about my home and my life were welcome when requested, but irrelevant when not. She asked me if I really thought it was reasonable to expect them to live surrounded by outdated decorations and old photographs that didn't reflect their taste or their lifestyle. She pointed out that they were young adults trying to build a life together, and that they deserved to feel comfortable in their own home. I reminded her that this wasn't their home. This was my home, where they lived as my guests, and that guests who didn't like their accommodations were always free to find housing that better suited their preferences. I told her that if my decorating style was so offensive to her sensibilities, I would be happy to help her and Marcus find an apartment they could afford on their combined salaries. The offer was genuine but pointed, because we both knew that their comfortable lifestyle depended on living rent-free in my house, that the money they were saving was allowing Stephanie to work part-time while she pursued her graduate degree, and that finding comparable housing would require significant lifestyle adjustments they had shown no inclination to make. Stephanie's mask slipped a little further, revealing the anger she had been working so hard to control. She told me that she had tried to be patient with my adjustment issues, that she understood it was difficult for elderly people to accept changes, but that she wasn't going to spend her marriage walking on eggshells around someone who refused to accept reality. The phrase adjustment issues was particularly insulting, suggesting that my objections to being erased from my own home were psychological problems rather than legitimate grievances. The reference to elderly people was designed to make me feel like my age disqualified me from having valid opinions about my own life. And the accusation that I was refusing to accept reality was a classic manipulation tactic, suggesting that the reality she preferred was the only legitimate one. But I had spent too many years dealing with people who thought they could intimidate me with condescension and fake concern to be rattled by Stephanie's amateur psychological warfare. Instead, I smiled at her with the kind of patience I had learned to cultivate during decades of dealing with difficult patients and their families. I told her that I appreciated her concern about my adjustment to reality, but that my reality was quite clear. I was a homeowner, she was not. I was the legal decision-maker for this property, she was not. I was the person whose name appeared on deeds and insurance policies and tax records, she was not. If anyone was having trouble accepting reality, it wasn't me. I also told her that I had no intention of spending my remaining years walking on eggshells around someone who thought marriage to my son gave her the right to redesign my life. If she found my presence in my own home inconvenient, if she felt constrained by having to consider my feelings and preferences, then she was welcome to create her own home where she could make all the decisions without interference from the woman who had raised her husband. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, but the fundamental positions had been established. Stephanie wanted me to accept a subordinate role in my own home, to defer to her vision of how our family should function, and to gradually fade into the background until I could be moved elsewhere without causing too much disruption. I wanted her to accept that she was living in my house on my terms, that major decisions would be made by me, and that her comfort was important but not more important than mine. By the time Marcus came downstairs for breakfast, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Stephanie had tried negotiation, manipulation, and intimidation, and I had countered each approach with calm firmness and legal reality. She now understood that I was not going to be managed, controlled, or gradually eliminated from my own life, no matter how reasonable she tried to make her demands sound. Marcus looked back and forth between us, clearly hoping that we had worked everything out overnight and that he wouldn't have to choose sides in an ongoing conflict. What he found instead were two women who had reached completely incompatible conclusions about how our household should function, and who were both looking to him to declare which vision of reality he was prepared to support. I poured him a cup of coffee and told him that Stephanie and I had been discussing the changes we talked about the night before, and that I was looking forward to seeing my photographs back on the mantelpiece and my belongings returned to their proper places. I said it pleasantly, as if we were discussing routine household maintenance rather than the fundamental power structure of our family. Stephanie added that she hoped we could all be flexible and considerate as we worked through these adjustments, and that she was sure we could find solutions that honored everyone's needs and preferences. She said it with the kind of diplomatic smile that made her sound reasonable while committing to absolutely nothing. Marcus drank his coffee and nodded at both of us, clearly trying to buy time while he figured out how to navigate between his wife's expectations and his mother's ultimatums. But the decision had already been made for him by the conversation he and I had the night before, by the legal realities I had shared with him, and by the consequences that would follow if he chose his wife's comfort over his mother's dignity. He might not have been ready to admit it yet, but Marcus was about to learn the same lesson his wife was learning, that some battles cannot be won through negotiation, manipulation, or emotional pressure. Sometimes the person with the most legal power and the least to lose is simply going to get their way, regardless of how unfair that might seem to everyone else involved. And in this particular battle, that person was me. The standoff lasted exactly 3 days. 3 days of Marcus trying to find a middle ground that didn't exist. Of Stephanie alternating between cold politeness and barely contained fury. And of me going about my normal routine while everyone else tiptoed around the house like they were walking through a minefield. On the third morning, I woke up to find boxes in the hallway outside their bedroom, and I knew the decision had finally been made. Marcus appeared in the kitchen while I was having my morning coffee, looking like he hadn't slept in weeks. His hair was disheveled, his shirt was wrinkled, and he had the defeated expression of a man who had spent too many hours arguing about things he couldn't change. He poured himself coffee with shaking hands and sat down across from me without making eye contact. He told me that he and Stephanie had decided to move out, that they had found a rental house across town that would be available at the end of the month. He said it like he was announcing a business decision rather than the dissolution of our living arrangement, keeping his voice carefully neutral to avoid betraying which one of them had actually made the choice. I asked him if this was what he wanted, or if this was Stephanie's ultimatum, because there was a significant difference between the two scenarios. If he genuinely believed that separate living arrangements would be better for everyone, then I would support his decision and help him make the transition as smooth as possible. But if Stephanie had forced him to choose between his wife and his mother, then we had a different kind of problem that wouldn't be solved by him moving out. Marcus finally looked at me directly, and I could see the exhaustion in his eyes, the weight of trying to maintain loyalty to two women who wanted fundamentally different things from him. He told me that Stephanie couldn't handle living under someone else's rules, that she felt like she was suffocating under my authority, that she needed her own space where she could make decisions without having to consider my preferences. But then he added something that surprised me. He said that part of him was relieved to be making this choice, that living together had revealed incompatibilities he hadn't expected, and that maybe some distance would help all of us remember what we meant to each other before the power struggles and territory disputes had poisoned our relationships. It was the most honest thing he had said to me in months, an acknowledgement that the situation had become toxic for everyone involved, and that continuing to force proximity wasn't going to magically create harmony. I appreciated his honesty, even though it confirmed what I had already suspected, that Stephanie had been systematically undermining our family relationships from the moment she moved into my house. I told Marcus that I was sorry things had reached this point, that I had hoped we could find a way to live together respectfully, but that I understood why Stephanie felt she needed her own domain where she could exercise complete control. I also told him that my door would always be open to him, that he was welcome to visit anytime he wanted, and that our relationship didn't have to be damaged by his wife's inability to coexist with the woman who had raised him. But I also made it clear that certain things were not negotiable, regardless of where he chose to live. I would not be visiting their new house until Stephanie apologized for telling me I wasn't family, and for throwing my belongings in the garbage. I would not be attending family events where I was expected to pretend that her behavior had been acceptable, and I would not be contributing financially to their new household expenses, since they had made it clear that my generosity came with too many strings attached. Marcus nodded like he had expected these conditions, though I could see him mentally calculating the financial impact of losing free housing and the various forms of support I had been providing without them even realizing it. The grocery money I never asked them to contribute, the utility bills I paid without complaint, the occasional car repairs and medical expenses I had covered because I wanted to help them get established. He asked me if I would consider changing my will back to its original form once they moved out, once the immediate tensions were resolved, and we had time to rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. The question revealed both his continued expectation that he would inherit everything I owned, and his awareness that his recent behavior had jeopardized that inheritance. I told him that my will would reflect the state of our relationship at the time of my death, whenever that might be. If he wanted to ensure that he was remembered generously, then he needed to treat me generously, while I was still alive to appreciate it. Inheritance was earned through decades of love and respect, not owed because of biological connection. The conversation was interrupted by Stephanie appearing in the kitchen doorway, dressed for her morning workout but clearly more interested in monitoring our discussion than in exercising. She had probably been listening from the hallway, trying to gauge whether Marcus was sticking to whatever agreement they had reached about how to handle this transition. She announced that she had contacted the moving company and scheduled the truck for Saturday morning, giving us less than a week to complete their exodus from my house. The timeline was aggressive, clearly designed to prevent second thoughts or extended negotiations about the terms of their departure. She also informed me that she would need to use my kitchen that afternoon to prepare food for her book club, since she had committed to hosting before they had decided to move. The request was phrased like a courtesy but delivered like an expectation, as if my kitchen was still available for her use until the moment she officially moved out. I told her that would be fine, but that she would need to clean up completely afterward and return everything to exactly the way she found it. I also mentioned that since this would be her last time using my kitchen, she might want to take photographs of any recipes or cooking techniques she wanted to remember, because she wouldn't be welcome to return for reference purposes. The comment was delivered with perfect politeness but unmistakable finality, a reminder that once she left my house, she would be leaving permanently. Stephanie's eyes narrowed slightly, but she managed to maintain her composed expression as she agreed to my terms. Over the following days, I watched them pack their belongings with a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because the constant tension and power struggles would finally end. Sadness because this was not how I had envisioned my relationship with my son's wife developing. I had genuinely hoped that we could build a warm, supportive relationship, that she would become the daughter I had never had. Instead, I was watching her pack away 3 years of gifts I had given her, keepsakes from family trips we had taken together, and photographs from holidays where she had seemed genuinely happy to be part of our family. Either she had been an exceptional actress all along, or something fundamental had changed in her attitude toward me and our relationship. Marcus spent most of the week at work or running errands related to the move, avoiding the house except when absolutely necessary. When he was home, he was distant and preoccupied, speaking only when spoken to and treating me with the kind of careful politeness you might show a dangerous acquaintance whose unpredictable behavior required constant vigilance. It hurt, watching my son treat me like a stranger he was afraid of offending, but I understood that he was processing the collapse of his assumptions about how his life would unfold. He had expected to gradually inherit my house and my assets while maintaining his position as my beloved only child. Instead, he was moving into a rental property while wondering whether his inheritance prospects had been permanently damaged by his wife's arrogance. The morning of the move, I woke up early and made breakfast for everyone, not because I felt obligated to feed them, but because I wanted our final shared meal to be memorable for the right reasons. I made Marcus's favorite pancakes and Stephanie's preferred yogurt parfait, and I set the table with my good china as if we were celebrating something worth commemorating. Stephanie came downstairs dressed in designer jeans and a cashmere sweater, looking more like she was heading to a photo shoot than helping load boxes into a moving truck. She accepted the breakfast I offered but ate in silence, checking her phone occasionally and maintaining the kind of polite distance that suggested she couldn't wait to be finished with this charade of domestic harmony. Marcus was more communicative, thanking me for the food and commenting on how good everything tasted, trying to inject some normalcy into what was obviously an awkward situation. But I could see the guilt in his expression, the awareness that he was choosing his wife's preferences over his mother's feelings, and that this choice might have consequences he wasn't prepared to face. When the moving truck arrived, I retreated to my bedroom to avoid the chaos of boxes and furniture being carried down the stairs and out the front door. I didn't want to watch my son's belongings disappear, didn't want to see the guest room where they had lived being emptied of everything that had made it theirs. But I could hear everything. The heavy footsteps of the movers, the scraping of furniture against walls, the muffled conversations about which items went where, and how to protect fragile objects during transport. The sounds of a life being relocated, of a living arrangement being dissolved, of a family being reconfigured in ways that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. Around noon, Marcus knocked on my bedroom door and asked if I wanted to say goodbye before they left. I came downstairs to find Stephanie standing in the empty living room, looking around like she was mentally cataloging everything she was leaving behind. The family photographs were back on the mantelpiece where they belonged, the throw pillows were arranged according to my preferences, and the abstract art pieces she had preferred were nowhere to be seen. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between resentment and regret, though I suspected the regret was more about losing the financial benefits of living in my house than about damaging our relationship. She thanked me for letting them stay as long as they had, said she hoped we could work toward a better understanding in the future, and extended her hand for a formal handshake. I shook her hand politely but without warmth, and told her that I hoped their new home would give them the independence and control they had been seeking. I also told her that when she was ready to apologize for the things she had said and done, she knew where to find me. Until then, I wished her well but didn't expect to see much of her. Stephanie's composed mask slipped just slightly at the mention of an apology, suggesting that she still didn't believe she had done anything wrong, that she still saw herself as the victim of my unreasonable demands rather than the instigator of our conflict. But she recovered quickly, smiled tightly, and headed toward the door where the moving truck was waiting. Marcus lingered after she left, clearly struggling with how to end this chapter of our relationship. He told me he loved me, that he was grateful for everything I had done for him, and that he hoped we could repair the damage that had been done to our relationship. He asked if he could call me in a few days, once they were settled in their new place, to talk about how we wanted to handle holidays and family events going forward. I hugged him goodbye, longer and tighter than I had in months, and told him that I loved him too. I also told him that love required respect, that respect required boundaries, and that healthy relationships required both people to feel valued and heard. If he could remember those principles, then we would be fine. If he couldn't, then we would have ongoing problems that no amount of affection could solve. After the moving truck disappeared down the street, I walked through my house slowly, room by room, reclaiming the spaces that had been occupied by other people's preferences and priorities for the better part of a year. The guest room where they had slept, the bathroom where Stephanie had stored her expensive skincare products, the kitchen where she had attempted to establish dominion over my cooking and meal planning. Everything was exactly as it should be, arranged according to my taste and filled with my belongings and my memories. But the house felt different, quieter and more peaceful, as if a source of constant background stress had suddenly been eliminated. For the first time in months, I could walk through my own home without wondering whose mood I might be affecting, whose plans I might be disrupting, whose vision of domestic perfection I might be compromising. That evening, I called Margaret and invited her over for dinner. I told her about the week's events, about the conversations with Marcus and the confrontation with Stephanie, about the move and the conditions I had established for future contact. Margaret listened without judgment, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me process the emotional complexity of watching my son choose his wife over his mother. Margaret had been through her own version of this conflict years earlier, when her daughter-in-law had tried to limit her access to her grandchildren and control the terms of family gatherings. She understood the deep, particular pain of being rejected by someone you had welcomed into your family, the confusion of having your generosity reinterpreted as interference, the heartbreak of watching your child participate in your own marginalization. She also understood the strength it took to establish boundaries when everyone around you was pressuring you to be more accommodating, more understanding, more willing to sacrifice your own comfort for the sake of family harmony. She told me that she was proud of how I had handled the situation, that I had been both firm and fair, and that my willingness to let them leave rather than continue fighting had probably saved my relationship with Marcus from permanent damage. Margaret stayed until nearly midnight, and we talked about everything from family dynamics to legal strategies to the challenge of maintaining dignity when younger people assume that age equals irrelevance. By the time she left, I felt more centered and confident than I had in months, assured that I had made the right choices even though they had been difficult ones. The next few weeks passed quietly, with a routine that felt both familiar and new. I woke up when I wanted to wake up, ate breakfast at my own pace, and spent my days reading, gardening, and catching up with friends I hadn't seen much of, while Marcus and Stephanie were living with me. I rediscovered the pleasure of having control over my environment, of making decisions without having to consider anyone else's preferences, of being the undisputed authority in my own home. Marcus called twice during that period, brief conversations where he asked about my health and told me about their new house and how Stephanie was adjusting to having her own space. The calls were polite but formal, lacking the easy familiarity we had shared before his marriage, before the power struggles had poisoned our interactions. I could tell that he was waiting for me to make the first move toward reconciliation, to reach out with an invitation or a gesture that would signal my willingness to forget the unpleasantness and resume our previous relationship, but I was waiting for something different. Evidence that he understood what had gone wrong, that he recognized his role in allowing our relationship to deteriorate, and that he was prepared to establish the kind of boundaries that would prevent similar conflicts in the future. 3 weeks after they moved out, Stephanie called me directly. I was so surprised to see her name on my caller ID that I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won over caution, and I picked up the phone. Her voice was different than I remembered, less confident and more tentative, as if she wasn't sure how I would receive her call. She told me that she had been thinking about our last conversation, about the things I had said about apologies, and working toward better understanding. She said that she wanted to meet for coffee to discuss our relationship and see if there was a way forward that would work for everyone involved. I was skeptical of her motives, but intrigued by the possibility that she might be ready to acknowledge the damage she had caused and take responsibility for her behavior. I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop downtown that neither of us frequented, where we could have a private conversation without the weight of history that surrounded interactions in my house. 2 days later, I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner where we would have privacy but where I could also see the entrance. Stephanie arrived exactly on time, looking more subdued than I had ever seen her, dressed in simple clothes without her usual attention to fashion and presentation. She ordered a plain coffee instead of her usual elaborate specialty drink, and sat down across from me with the careful posture of someone who was trying to appear humble without actually feeling humble. She thanked me for agreeing to meet with her, and said that she had been doing a lot of thinking since they moved out. Then she began what was clearly a prepared speech, delivered in the tone of someone who had practiced the words but wasn't entirely convinced of their truth. She said that she realized she had been insensitive to my feelings, that she had been focused on creating her ideal home environment without considering that it was my home first, and that my preferences should have taken priority. She said that she regretted the way she had handled the situation with my family photographs, that she should have talked to me before making any changes, and that she understood why I had been hurt by finding them in a garbage bag. She said that her comment about me not being family anymore had been cruel and unfair, and that she wanted to take it back. It was a reasonable apology, covering the major points of conflict between us and acknowledging specific behaviors that had been inappropriate. But something about the delivery felt hollow, calculated rather than genuine, as if she was saying what she thought I wanted to hear, rather than expressing authentic remorse for the pain she had caused. I thanked her for the apology and told her that I appreciated her willingness to acknowledge the problems in our relationship, but I also asked her what had changed in her understanding of our situation, what insights had led her to this moment of reflection, and what she planned to do differently going forward. Stephanie's composed expression flickered slightly, suggesting that she had expected her apology to be sufficient and hadn't prepared for follow-up questions about her motivations and intentions. She mumbled something about wanting family harmony and realizing that her approach had been counterproductive. But then she shifted into what seemed to be the real purpose of our meeting. She told me that Marcus had been struggling with guilt about the way things had ended, that he missed our previous closeness, and that he was worried about the long-term impact on our relationship. She said that she wanted to find a way for all of us to move forward, to rebuild trust, and create new traditions that would work for our changed circumstances. The phrasing was telling, focusing on Marcus's emotional state rather than her own responsibility for creating the situation that had hurt him. She was positioning herself as the caring wife who wanted to fix her husband's pain rather than the person whose behavior had caused that pain in the first place. I asked her directly whether this conversation was her idea or Marcus's idea, whether she was here because she genuinely wanted to repair our relationship, or because he had asked her to make peace with me. The question clearly caught her off guard, and she took several seconds to formulate a response. Finally, she admitted that Marcus had been encouraging her to reach out to me, that he felt caught in the middle between two women he loved, and that he hoped we could find common ground that would allow him to maintain close relationships with both of us. She said that she hadn't wanted to make the call initially, but that she had come to realize that her pride was less important than her husband's happiness. It was a more honest answer than I had expected, an acknowledgement that her apology was motivated by practical concerns rather than genuine remorse. But it also revealed something important about the dynamics in their marriage, about Marcus's continued attachment to me, and his unwillingness to accept the complete severing of our relationship that Stephanie had initially demanded. I told her that I appreciated her honesty about her motivations, and that I was glad Marcus still valued our relationship enough to work toward repairing it. But I also told her that any reconciliation between us would require more than apologies and good intentions. It would require genuine changes in behavior, consistent respect for boundaries, and a fundamental shift in how she understood my role in Marcus's life. I explained that I wasn't interested in being tolerated as an inconvenient family obligation that had to be managed carefully to keep Marcus happy. I wasn't interested in being included in family events as a token gesture, while being excluded from meaningful decisions and conversations. And I wasn't interested in pretending that our previous conflicts hadn't happened, in order to maintain an artificial peace that could be shattered the moment someone's preferences were challenged. If she wanted a real relationship with me, then she needed to accept that I was Marcus's mother, that our bond preceded her relationship with him by decades, and that my opinions and preferences mattered to him whether she liked it or not. She needed to stop seeing me as competition for his affection, and start seeing me as a resource who could enrich their lives if treated with appropriate respect. Stephanie listened to this speech with a kind of careful attention that suggested she was taking notes for future reference, rather than absorbing the emotional content of what I was saying. When I finished talking, she nodded thoughtfully and said that she understood my conditions and was willing to work within them. But then she asked if I would be willing to make some accommodations as well, to recognize that their marriage required privacy and independence, and to avoid interfering with decisions that primarily affected their household rather than mine. She wanted assurance that I wouldn't use my financial leverage or emotional influence with Marcus to undermine her position in their marriage. It was a fair request, actually, an acknowledgement that healthy relationships required boundaries on both sides, and that my power in the family dynamic could be misused just as easily as hers could be. I told her that I had no interest in interfering with their marriage or controlling their household decisions, that I wanted Marcus to be happy even if his choices weren't what I would have chosen for him. But I also told her that respect and influence were earned through consistent behavior over time, and that if she wanted to be the primary voice in Marcus's ear, she needed to prove that her advice was wise, her judgment was sound, and her love for him was stronger than her desire to control him. If she could do that, then she wouldn't need to worry about competition from his mother. We talked for another hour, negotiating the terms of our tentative peace treaty and establishing ground rules for future interactions. By the time we left the coffee shop, we had reached an understanding that felt more like a diplomatic agreement between former enemies than a genuine reconciliation. But it was a starting point for something that might eventually become more authentic. 2 months later, Marcus called to invite me to their housewarming party. A small gathering of friends and family to celebrate their new home and their first successful months of independent living. The invitation was extended with genuine warmth, the first time in over a year that he had sounded truly happy to be talking to me. I accepted the invitation and spent considerable time choosing an appropriate gift, something that would acknowledge their achievement without being so expensive that it created obligation or guilt. I settled on a beautiful cutting board made from local wood, engraved with their names and the date they moved into their house. Practical, personal, and proportionate to the occasion. The party was exactly what I had expected, well organized, tastefully decorated, and carefully choreographed to present the image of a successful young couple who had everything under control. Stephanie had transformed their rental house into a showplace worthy of a magazine spread, with fresh flowers, coordinated linens, and strategic lighting that made every room look like a professional photograph. She greeted me at the door with a smile that seemed genuinely warm, thanked me for the cutting board gift, and introduced me to several of her friends as Marcus's wonderful mother, rather than using the more neutral phrasing she had previously preferred. It was a small gesture, but it suggested that she was making an effort to publicly acknowledge my importance in Marcus's life. Throughout the evening, I watched her interact with other guests, managing conversations and logistics, with the same efficiency she had once applied to managing my household. But there was something different about her behavior. A relaxation and confidence that had been missing when she lived in my house. She was clearly more comfortable being the undisputed authority in her own space, even if that space was smaller and less luxurious than what she had left behind. Marcus was equally relaxed and happy, moving through the party with the ease of someone who felt at home in his environment and comfortable with his choices. He spent considerable time talking with me, asking about my health and my activities, sharing stories about their new neighborhood and his recent projects at work. At one point during the evening, he pulled me aside and thanked me for giving him and Stephanie the space to figure out their relationship, without the complications that had been created by their living in my house. He said that the distance had helped all of us gain perspective, and that he felt more confident about managing the competing demands of being a husband and a son, now that those roles were being performed in different physical spaces. He also told me that Stephanie had shared details about their coffee shop conversation, that she had explained my conditions for reconciliation and her commitment to meeting them. He said that he appreciated my willingness to work toward rebuilding our relationship despite how badly things had deteriorated, and that he hoped we could create new traditions that would work better for everyone involved. Near the end of the party, as guests were beginning to leave and Stephanie was busy with cleanup logistics, Marcus asked if I would be interested in having dinner with just him sometime soon. He said that there were things he wanted to discuss about our relationship, about his marriage, and about his understanding of what had gone wrong during the months we had lived together. I told him that I would enjoy having dinner with him, that I missed our one-on-one conversations, and that I was proud of how he was handling the challenge of building a marriage while maintaining his connection to his family of origin. I also told him that I loved him, that I was happy to see him happy, and that our relationship had survived this test stronger than it had been before. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed since the morning I found Stephanie packing away my family photographs. The crisis that had felt like it might destroy my relationship with my son had instead forced all of us to establish healthier boundaries, to communicate more directly about our needs and expectations, and to recognize that love without respect was ultimately unsustainable. I had learned that I was stronger than I had realized, that I was capable of standing up for myself even when it meant risking relationships that mattered deeply to me. I had learned that my home was truly mine, that my authority was real and legally protected, and that I didn't have to accept disrespect from anyone, regardless of their relationship to me. Marcus had learned that marriage required him to balance competing loyalties without abandoning his fundamental values, that his wife's comfort was important, but not more important than basic decency, and that some battles were worth fighting even when the stakes seemed impossibly high. And Stephanie had learned that charm and manipulation were insufficient tools for controlling other people, that respect could not be demanded but had to be earned, and that her happiness depended on building genuine relationships rather than extracting compliance from people she saw as obstacles to her goals. The months that followed were marked by gradual improvement in all of our relationships. Marcus and I resumed our regular phone calls and occasional dinners. Rebuilding the easy communication we had shared before his marriage had complicated our dynamics. Stephanie and I maintained polite contact, attending family events together and exchanging pleasantries, without the underlying tension that had characterized our previous interactions. I never did move to a senior living facility, never did sign away my decision-making authority, and never did accept a subordinate role in my own life. Instead, I continued living independently in the house I had worked for decades to own, surrounded by the possessions and memories I had chosen to keep, making my own decisions about my health, my finances, and my future. 6 months after the housewarming party, Marcus called to tell me that he and Stephanie were expecting their first child. The news was delivered with genuine excitement and joy, and he asked if I would be interested in being involved as a grandmother, helping with babysitting, and offering the kind of support and wisdom that grandparents traditionally provided. I told him that I would be delighted to be a grandmother, that I looked forward to having a grandchild to spoil and teach and love. But I also told him that my role in the baby's life would depend on how I was treated by the baby's parents, that children learn about relationships by watching the adults around them, and that I wanted to model dignity and self-respect for the next generation. He assured me that things would be different this time, that he and Stephanie had learned from their previous mistakes, and that they both valued my potential contribution to their child's life. He said that they wanted to establish traditions and boundaries that would work for everyone, and that they hoped I would help them figure out how to balance their needs as new parents with my needs as a grandmother. A year later, I was holding my grandson for the first time in the same hospital where Marcus had been born 32 years earlier. Stephanie was tired but radiant, Marcus was nervous but proud, and I was overwhelmed by the familiar miracle of new life and new possibilities. As I looked down at that tiny face, I thought about the journey that had brought us to this moment, the conflicts and reconciliations that had tested all of our relationships and ultimately made them stronger. I thought about the woman I had been when Stephanie first told me I wasn't family anymore, the woman who had been willing to fade quietly into the background rather than fight for her place in her son's life. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood her own worth, who demanded appropriate treatment, and who refused to accept less than she deserved from the people who claimed to love her. Someone who had learned that being family meant more than sharing blood or living under the same roof, that it meant treating each other with dignity and respect, even when disagreements arose. As I handed the baby back to his parents and prepared to leave them to begin their new life as a family of 3, I knew that the battles I had fought had been worth every difficult moment. Not because I had won, exactly, but because I had refused to disappear quietly when someone decided I was inconvenient. I had reminded everyone who knew me, including myself, that Patricia Ann Caldwell was not going anywhere until she was good and ready to go. And when that time eventually came, it would be on my terms, surrounded by people who valued me, in the home I had built with my own hands and my own strength. Until then, I would continue to live fully, love deeply, and stand firmly on the foundation I had spent a lifetime creating. Because some things are too important to surrender, no matter what anyone else might prefer. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.